Hello and welcome to Dungeons and Drama Nerds. My name is Todd and I'm here today with Nick.
Hey there.
And Percy.
Hello.
And this week we have a special guest, James D'Amato of the One Shot Podcast and the author of the Ultimate RPG Gameplay Guide, the Ultimate RPG Character Backstory Guide, the Ultimate Micro RPG Book, and most recently the Ultimate RPG Game Master's Worldbuilding Guide.
Hello, heroes. I want to thank you for that lovely introduction and also point out that I was only the author of one of the games and the introduction to the micro RPG book. That is an anthology, and there are 39 truly wonderful contributors that are also part of that book.
Excellent. But James, to start with, can you tell our listeners a little bit about your introduction to tabletop role-playing games?
Sure thing. I actually got introduced to tabletop role-playing games in college. When I was going to Allegheny College, there was this wonderful club on campus called Argo. I think it was like the Allegheny Role-Playing Game organization, maybe. But they were doing these introduction to Dungeons and Dragons games, and I had absolutely no interest in it, and I walked right by that club table. However, like a couple weeks into the first semester, there was somebody that I very much wanted to meet and get to know better. And one of my friends had signed up for the introduction to D&D game. And that person that I wanted to get to know had also signed up for that game. So I did ask my friend very much to drop out of that game so I could get in and get to know this person. So I am the quintessential fake nerd. I am really just in it to meet people and get attention. And I am systematically destroying this hobby.
Excellent. We love that. I think we all aspire to do that in our own way. Destroy the hobby.
Yeah. Take it away from the old grognards. Why not?
Exactly.
The important takeaway is that this is a hobby for handsome queers. It's not a hobby for mean old people. That's for sure.
For sure.
Wonderful. We were also wondering, because we're a podcast about the intersection of theater and tabletop games, and I know that you have a background in improv and theater. You've trained at Second City and IO, if I remember correctly. So we were curious if there are ways that you use your improv and theater training in role-playing, and particularly thinking about this book, the Game Master's World-Building Guide, if there are any ways that you use improv in building a world or a kind of collaborative story together.
Absolutely. I mean, this is an interesting question. I am somebody who I think I can say a lot of these things more freely now because many of the theaters that I trained at for improv no longer exist post-pandemic. And that is that role-playing games are actually extremely sophisticated improv forms. I consider improv and role-playing to be no different from one another. If there is a difference in the techniques that were taught at places like IO or Second City, it is that you are learning how to create in those spaces with the idea that whatever you create is going to be presented to an audience. Improv is fun, no matter how we do it. Now, I think theater and acting and performance is fun generally, but role-playing is something that ostensibly, we're just there to do for ourselves. We are there to enjoy it. We aren't, in most circumstances, thinking about, well, if somebody were to observe this story, what would their experience of it be? So that might be the difference. But at the end of the day, you immerse yourself in a character. You share an imaginary space with a group of people, and together you build on each other's ideas. And that results in a story experience, which is, fun and rewarding in its own right. And improv, functions on a similar mechanism. One of the buzzwords that gets thrown around for improv is yes and. The idea idea that you accept the reality that is proposed by your scene partners and you build upon that reality. I point out in the gameplay guide that's kind of like a slightly misunderstood concept. A lot of people use that to presuppose that like you are supposed to agree to every single idea that is put in front of you and that you have no agency or will to reject ideas, which I don't think is a particularly safe way to do improv or role playing. But the idea that ideas that are put in front of you are real. Like if somebody tells your character, hey, drink this big glass of poison, you should not go, yes, I'll drink a glass of poison. You should go, yes, you've handed me a glass of poison, but no, I will decline in drinking it. So all that is to say, the fundamental mechanisms that make both of these things work are the same. And so in what I do with actual play is I'm combining both of those ideas. I am using the sophisticated and mechanics-driven improv forms that are role-playing games as performance pieces. And most of the people who are on One Shot, and certainly the people who are on Campaign, are folks who are trained to create improvisationally with an audience in mind. So, if there is a difference between our program and a program with people who don't have that experience in improv or theater, it is that when we make our choices, and we've trained ourselves reflexively when we make our choices to make those choices be interesting to observe, and also like try to embody our characters in a way that is interesting to observe, in a way that you might not if you are doing role play, specifically for the joy of role play. I think there are plenty of private groups that would be extremely wonderful to watch and entertaining to observe, but that's not always the case, and that's because it's for them. It's a private thing, and certainly the way we do it is just one way to approach it, but it is my favorite way, and I don't think I really could do it another way because I have all of this experience in improv and theater, and those are things that I truly love. So that is a style that I want to showcase and show people like, this is one of the ways that you can enjoy this hobby.
One of my favorite parts of the Game Master's Worldbuilding Guide, because I find that I think the TTRPG community is really bad at like defining what they mean when they use words like game or player. So I really love the section where you sort of operationally define, this is what I mean when I say certain terms. And I'm always interested in how people specifically define what a role-playing game is. So I'm curious, you define it as a type of game in which players generate stories through shared imagination. And I'm curious about how you maybe arrived at that definition.
Yeah, that was a tough one, and like a journey. I think that was like several books long, because I had originally, I think there's a definition in the character backstory guide as well, the first book that I published, and I was not planning on including a definition of role playing. Or, even GM or PC or any related terms in those books, because one of the things that I kind of resent that we feel is necessary in the role-playing hobby is so many role-playing games open with a sort of apologetic explanation for the activity that you're about to do. And this is a thing that we do in role-playing games, but we never think to do in like board games. We don't go, a board game is where you use cardboard pieces and plastic pieces to tell the story of winning the most points and how bankrupt the capitalistic system of real estate is in the United States. Like, no, we don't do that because like that's a buck wild thing to do. But role-playing games, we have this real chip on our shoulder of like, well, nobody understands what it is we do. And my publisher did eventually bully me in like, hey, we want this to be a general use product. We want this to be something that somebody can pick up even if they don't play role-playing games or have never played a role-playing game before. One of when I was talking with my editor, one of the audiences that we kind of identified was, there is a big group of people who watch Critical Role who have never played D&D. And like, that is a group of people that I am like kind of invested in. Like, well, I kind of want to get you at the table playing your own stories. Like, it's so wonderful that you get to watch that this group of talented voice actors and performers play their game. But like, your favorite game should be your own game. And so we, like, with that in mind, it's like, okay, we should include these definitional terms, because if there is a chance that this book could be a bridge to somebody sitting down and playing their first game for the first time, we have to embrace that. So I was given very strict word count requirements for what I was allowed to define about what a role-playing game is, about what a game master is, and what a PC is. So for role-playing game, I was really trying to distill it, like, what is the thing that makes this special? Why is this different than the war games that this was born out of, or even the role-playing games that people play when they are, playing RPGs on the computer? And I really think the thing that is special, that makes these games different, is that shared imaginary space. Now, there are also solo RPGs, so that kind of gets a little hairy, but certainly a lot of what I'm talking about in this is I'm talking about a game with one or more players, and the thing that is making it work and the thing that is making it special is you are both agreeing on a fictional scenario in that case, and the game mechanics are there to help you shape that fictional scenario. So that's kind of where I got at. So that's why the definition is that way. And moving on to creating a definition for GM versus PC, I find there are a lot of games where they will refer to the GM or the DM, the person running the game, by that title, and they will refer to everybody else involved in the game as the players, which is buck wild, because the GM is absolutely still playing the game. Their role might be different and they might have slightly different responsibilities, but they're playing. We like to pretend sometimes that it is a slog or work to be a GM. And for some people it is, because that's not the role that they enjoy most. But for me, I prefer it. I always get a little antsy when I'm not in the GM spot because I like some of the definitional freedom that you get from that role. So I wanted to assert that everybody involved in the game is a player, and there is a differential between roles where you have somebody who sometimes represents not just a character, but a whole cast of characters and forces in the world outside of character, and everyone else is representing an individual character and sort of playing that character off of those external forces. That does feel like an important separation and definition. So I distilled it down to you've got the game master and you've got the player characters. And, we kind of used for the individual who is playing the character and the character itself, PC was a interchangeable term in that way to sort of settle people into the idea that this character is you are this character. When we're putting these scenarios and whatnot in front of you, we're putting them in front of you both in a way. So that's kind of what we were driving at. We wanted to make the book accessible, and I wanted to let everyone feel like no matter what your role is in the game, you are still playing the game, and still give people the impression that there are different expectations based on the role you are taking into your game.
I love that, because I feel like there's this dominant narrative of beleaguered GM and players who are deliberately antagonizing their beleaguered GM, and that's not fun at all. Why would you do that?
like I can understand from a certain like satirical perspective, because like we've all had games that were less than great, and it can definitely feel like if you're in the GM role that sometimes how like this group must be antagonizing me because they walk away from the plot that I am setting up at every turn. Like how can that be anything but intentional? But like at the end of the day, we don't want to make that feeling the default experience for the hobby, because if that were the case, why would anybody do this? Like unless you really love herding cats or sometimes that chaos is nice and is fun, but like that is not really my experience when I think about role playing. And I want people to kind of go in with the idea that, oh, this is a fun thing. This is a fun thing where we work together. Even if our roles are different, even if our expectations are different, we are all working towards this together, which is one of the reasons that the gameplay guide itself was not specifically aimed at the game master. That is something that my publisher kind of wanted to happen for a little bit. And I pushed back against that, and it was like, no, because like the techniques and skills and whatnot involved in gameplay are shared between those roles. Like there is artistry in being a player, and you can approach being a player with that intentionally collaborative and build upon what I am giving you perspective that would also be helpful to the game master. So I wanted those ideas brought together and lower some of those separations while still giving people the tools they need to understand those structures.
Yeah, I love that, because I feel like you've named a dynamic that I have never had words for, which is that like a lot of TTRPGs preemptively decide that they have to justify their existence. And it's just like, no, like this is a game for fun. And like, let's set up the conditions for people to have fun playing a game. And that like, yeah, being a game is enough.
It is really wild. And I think it comes from the industry has not seen itself through a professional lens for much of its history, which means that the tone of rules explanations in a lot of cases has been more casual, but also more casual in a way that's not really approachable. Like if you are a fan, like I am, of the System Mastery podcast, where they read through old out of print RPGs, particularly like a lot of Heartbreakers, games that maybe had a lot of investment in them and didn't really go anywhere. The tone of so many of those books is asserting toxic group dynamics. They're kind of funny to think about. Like they'll talk about how many books talk about bribing the GM with pizza to get things that you want out of the game. And like, yeah, that's kind of a funny, charming, like hobby thing, like of, oh, yes, I will bribe my friend to get this thing. But also like when you're thinking of it in terms of, this is the dynamic that I am presenting to someone who might be playing for the first time. That's a weird way to open it. I can't imagine putting that in one of my books. I can't imagine telling people this is the way it is. This is the way it ideally works. Because again, I'm putting the rules of the game in front of you. So if you follow the rules, you should have an ideal play session. So it's kind of wild how common that is, or that was, and to see how that has changed and evolved. And maybe hopefully, 10 years down the line, we will be able to look, even at my definitions and go, well, now this is unnecessary because these games are intuitively understood to the same degree that something like a board game might be.
Shifting gears a little bit, I really enjoyed reading through your fantasy world building section. So many of the questions felt like obvious, but also the answers they provoked felt very revelatory. Like, of course you should wonder, like, where's your magic coming from? And like, how common or not common is it? But I feel like so many of these games just don't often.
Well, I mean, that's it's an interesting thing because a lot of the time I think game books are assuming that you are going to be using their setting, or that if you're going to use your own setting, that you're just going to make it up on your own. A lot of the pushback that I get against some of my books is like, well, I can make up my own character backstory, or I can make up my own world. And the answer is like, yeah, of course you can. You can also sit down with your friends and just tell a story together in a completely unstructured environment, but you use the game because it's fun. And the thing that I was trying to do with those questions is there are a lot of, like, at least for character backstory, at least, like there are a lot of books that are just full of random tables of, like, you know, random elements to put in your game, because to a lot of people, that's what a RPG is bringing to the table, is an element of randomness to be a basis for you to springboard your ideas off of. And that's fine, but I have come to love RPGs that provide a really cool, open-ended and thought-provoking, incisive question. You know, I think about a game like For the Queen, which is all just really great open-ended questions. That's how the entire game works. And so what I wanted to do with some of the questions and prompts in this book is channel people's thinking in a specific direction and give them a question that there could be 10,000 answers for, so that you can make an unlimited number of, like, settings through this book, but it is easy every time because you're answering a specific question. There's no choice paralysis. You know, in world building, you can literally do anything. You can decide there's never been gravity ever. You can not have humans even be a beginning concern in the world. You could be playing parameciums, for goodness sake. So that means that, like, that unlimited power actually makes it harder to create in certain circumstances. And I really wanted to ground people and provide them enough structure that allowed them to unlock that limitless potential of their imagination in the same way that I think role-playing games do through their mechanics.
That made me think of a different question, which is that I have encountered a lot of games recently that use questions in the similar way, but they're about character relationships as a springboard. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that as a way of sort of entering the world or creating a springboard that you can tell a story off of.
I think it's truly great. I mean, I think about Powered by the Apocalypse systems and the Bonds subsystem that shows up in a lot of different Powered by the Apocalypse games, where they are essentially like a fill-in-the-blank character relationship list, like blank is weak, so I will make them strong, sort of thing, which provides like a very easy story. And there are 10,000 ways to play out that story. And you can always ignore those bonds if you don't, you know, want to deal with them. But it is really cool to just give people something. If you give someone something to start with, it will be easy for them to create the next thing that comes after that. So I love any question that helps people define something about their characters. And, you know, going back to improv a little bit, one of the big things that we talk about when you are starting a scene, especially for long form improv, the thing that you want to get to as quickly as possible in your scene, if you can, is establish the relationship. You want to know where these characters are, who they are, but most importantly, who are they to each other? Because all of the fun that you're going to have in your scene is probably going to be built upon that. And you can be a brilliant creative genius who just pulls like funny and compelling ideas out of nowhere. Like, you know, we've seen Robin Williams do his thing for sure, but like that's a wild amount of pressure to put on yourself and, you know, not a great thing to do for performance. So instead, if you can create a character relationship that your audience can relate to, they will always have that foundation. And then kind of anything that you do on top of that will be relatable and easy for them to discover alongside you. Yeah.
And actually, I think another sort of link between those two things is I feel like those relationship questions make endowment a thing that is okay in the context of the game, in terms of like saying, this is true about your character from my character's perspective, and not feeling like shy or weird about saying like, this is a thing that I'm offering to you and you can decide to what extent you will accept it. Because I feel like I see a lot of paralysis in terms of like, I don't want to make decisions for anybody else, but at the same time,
Yeah, there is I really struggle with this because, I have certainly been criticized as a game master because people feel that I am overruling player agency in certain situations when I give my players, particularly on Skyjacks, like hey, this is a fact. This is, you have seen this person from your past, and this is a feeling that you are having. That sort of gift is something that is extremely common in improv. Like, it is really easy to start an improv scene and go, whoa, why are you so angry right now? Because that helps your co-performer go, oh, great, I just need to be angry to be honest to the scene. That's all I need. Or I need to be underwhelmingly monotone, and this person is just going to react like I'm popping off or what have you. So much fun that you can have. Regardless, like, that is actually a fun and useful gift, and giving the space to allow people to give those gifts to each other's characters, I think is actually really great encouragement. What I really don't like to see and don't have much fun with are situations where people never think about each other's characters. They're just bringing their characters to the table and bouncing their characters off the scenario. And it's like, this is supposed to be a group of traveling adventurers, and they don't care about each other. They don't playfully tease one another. They don't have crushes on each other. What is this? This isn't any close friend group that I've ever observed in my life. So I find it really compelling when a game or, an accessory structure to a game gives people reason to invest in each other's characters and each other's ideas. One of the things that I call out in the world building guide specifically is that all world building is collaborative. Even if you as the game master are creating your world, you are collaborating kind of with yourself, but you're also collaborating with your influences. You're collaborating with your intentions. You are taking foundational ideas and building on top of them. Yeah. So the spirit of that collaboration is something that you want to keep in mind. And one of the reasons that the book exists as an object is to be a collaborator to you, because collaborators, I think, make things easier. And also, in my selfish opinion, I think they make things better. I think that the stories that I tell through my role-playing games are generally better than they would have been if I decided to start drafting them alone. Now, I could always take those stories as a framework as a writer and tighten up like dialogue or whatnot. But generally speaking, working with other people, I think does lead to a better product, especially if your process and outlook for all of that is good.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think there is such a kind of stereotype, or that may not even be the right word, but an inheritance from the fantasy novel tradition where GMs who are building their own world think that they have to be like Tolkien or like Patrick Rothfuss, who actually wrote the introduction to this book or something. Like, they have this image of like the writer toiling away at the building of the world. And one of the things I love about the book is that it works to provide a sense of play and of like creativity and discovery rather than just of labor.
Yeah. And we really did want to emphasize that. Like, I think that connection gets drawn a lot because the driving force for a lot of especially early role-playing games is a kind of power fantasy. And the idea that you are Tolkien forging Middle Earth by the sharpness of your mind, and the fact that you're not dealing with a lot of homoerotic feelings, like that feels like a very appealing power fantasy to people, right? Like, so I think there is a continual hearkening back that like when you are GM, your word is law and you are a type of god and you forge your own world. But that does make the role seem lonely and like kind of a hassle. And I definitely want in all of my books for people to feel that there is a sense of play always, because that is what makes a lot of the stuff in this approachable to me. Like if somebody said, hey, do you want to, do a bunch of production work and, work in a writer's room for almost no money for like 5 years before you see anything, I would go, are you mad? That is a wild thing to propose to me. But if they're like, hey, do you want to run an actual play podcast and eventually maybe make money on it? It's like, oh yeah, sure. That's great because I'm playing and it's fun to do.
Harkening back a little bit to your discussion of like the book as a collaborator with GMs, Percy and Nick, I'm not sure if you felt this way too, but in many ways, the questions, the like thought-provoking questions that all of these exercises are designed to give, felt very much like the way a dramaturg works with a playwright. As a play is being written, like bouncing these like, oh, like how does this work in this? Or like how do you think about this thing? And hearing you think about this book as a collaborator, to me as a dramaturg who is that sort of like question asking collaborator, feels very like validating and cool.
Yeah.
I am so glad to hear that because my experience in theater, I did take theater classes in college, but I only took acting classes and I refused to take any theater history classes or structural classes because I found them intensely boring and all I wanted to do was the act of performing. And if I had to learn about a lot of old white men, like that wasn't really gonna cut it for me. So that means I miss out on a lot of the structure of how theater works sometimes. And it is extremely cool to hear that that's how the dramaturg process works and all that. Because the only experience I have with dramaturgs is past the playwright stage when it is a dramaturg director relationship trying to explain, well, these are the references that we're getting in this. And this is the structure of this joke. And these are the notes that we want to hit and whatnot, which I think is also intensely interesting, but it is really cool to know that is part of the drafting process as well.
Yeah, sort of like the thesis of our podcast is essentially that role-playing games are a shared dramaturgy among all of the people playing them, and that everybody
makes
is
a lot of sense. Yeah,
occupying that role.
That absolutely tracks. I really like that. And the relationship between the core thing that allows role-playing games to work, which in my opinion is collaboration, is definitely a part of theater. Like theater is all like everyone involved in the production is a part of the show and why the show works. Like you can't have the show if nobody's opening the curtains for it. So like it is all this big organism machine that functions together in a very complicated way to make this art that, is also kind of very simple and very human.
Shifting gears a little bit, is there a particular genre from the book that you favor in terms of games that you like to play or games that you like to watch other people play or participate in? And are there sort of particular like influences that you find yourself borrowing or stealing or drawing from particularly frequently?
That is an interesting question. I mean, on One Shot, because we try out so many different role-playing games there, I hop between genres all the time. So it's hard for me to look at any of the genres that I included in the book and call them a favorite. And there's also like there are plenty of genres that didn't make it into the book because I was trying to distill the genre selection to the most popular genres so that this book could be as useful as possible to as many people as possible. I will say of the sections that I really like in the book, one of the first exercises that I wrote was Enforcers from the punk section of the book. And that is like one of the things that I'm proudest of because punk, I think particularly in role-playing games and like general nerd media is not understood thematically or supported thematically. Like, we understand cyberpunk to a certain extent, but it is very easy to get lost in like neon and cool jackets and sometimes guns and robots. And like steampunk, I think especially, is dealt kind of a harsh blow in this, and that like it's very easy to get invested in gears and gadgets and Victorian clothing and not think about punk being the other part of it, where you need to have this dynamic of there being an oppressing force, there being an oppressed body, and there being punks that are actively resisting or acting counter to that oppression. And so the exercises, particularly, I think, in Enforcers, I think channels you to understand kind of the underlying structure of that genre. And if you use those exercises to create your punk universe, I think at the end of the day, you will have stronger punk stories, because foundationally your world will be tied to those themes and that dynamic, which I don't think a lot of the punk games do. Like if we look at Shadowrun, Shadowrun is a perfect example. There are so many holier than thou hipsters out there who will assert that Shadowrun is not a punk thing because you are playing mercenaries who work for a corporation in a dystopian future. Every single Shadowrun game that I have played has moved in a punk direction, because people, when confronted with circumstances like that, will act in their own self-interest, which is usually counter to their employers, because they kind of have the freedom of violence and the freedom of acting counter to rules. So like Shadowrun itself, nothing about how the game presents itself to you tells you to be a punk. You discover that on your own, which is why I think it is cyberpunk. However, if there was some, and that is because I think the Shadowrun universe is very much built on that punk dynamic, on that you have these mega corporations, they're doing horribly evil stuff, society is bad for everyone, and you are somebody who is like a literal murderer for hire, because that's what you have to do to survive within this world. Like, I think that pushes people in the punk direction, but there are certainly ways that you could mechanically support that dynamic as well, that might make the punk stronger, which is why some of the newer cyberpunk games, especially the ones like based in Blades in the Dark and Powered by the Apocalypse, I think do a better job of channeling players towards that dynamic, which is why I think some people are more comfortable identifying that as strong cyberpunk, which is to say, at the end of the day, what I was trying to do with the punk section, and the reason the punk section like is important to me and stands out, is I really think it will help people who want to play with punk settings and get all of like the cool stylistic feelings that they get out of punk fiction, while still having really substantive things that they say through the stories that they tell in their universes.
Mm-hmm.
I also, just while we're on this topic, I want to shout out that I loved the union building exercises in the sci-fi section. I thought that was excellent.
I had to fight for that one a little bit to justify to the publisher, like, well, why are we doing this? And I'm like, because nobody talks about unions. They should have a presence in our forward future thinking thing, especially because they are an entity that is not a government or a corporation. And it kind of reaches a point, like, I mean, you could look at George Lucas's work. It's like they're in Star Wars, there are only governments, corporations, and religions, and that's it. And it's like, well, that's pretty friggin' wild thing to happen in a world that is like literally 10,000 full worlds. But yeah, like I wanted to make sure that people had the option of like creating universes that felt a little bit more fleshed out and dynamic, because like some of the directions that I'm trying to channel people towards are things that maybe they wouldn't immediately think of by themselves. And that is what I think a good collaborator does, is kind of looks in directions and moves you in directions that, you know, you probably wouldn't on your own.
Heading back to like larger world building questions, as a GM, are there specific places that you tend to start when you're building a new world? Like, are there things that you're like, oh, I always start with this? Or
No, I like each, I think, thing is its own individual project and needs to be supported in specific ways. With Skyjacks, for instance, the beginning building blocks that I had is Johnny and JPC came to me because we knew that Star Wars campaign was going to be ending soon, and they still wanted to have work at the end of the day. So they're like, yeah, we gotta figure out our new show. And they came to me and they're like, we've got an idea, Sky Pirates. And that was the whole idea, which is a really cool like building block to begin with. So kind of the work that I had to do, like taking that and building upon that idea is like, okay, what do I find compelling about piracy? What do I find compelling about the sky? And I, went down a rabbit hole of like thinking of like, okay, what do I associate with piracy? Well, unfortunately, it is the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. And because I was into them in high school, I feel embarrassed by them now. So that's a non-starter. What do I do? The other answer that came out of that was, the music of the Decemberists makes me think of sad sailors all the time. So I decided to make that a cornerstone of the universe. I'm like, okay, if I'm using the music of the Decemberists as an inspiration, what I need to do is go through their discography and pull out characters and themes and dynamics and figure out a way to tie that tone into a world. And what I discovered is like, obviously a lot of what they're drawing from is classic folklore. And what I want is to kind of pull international folklore that fits the general kind of melancholy tone of Decemberist music and use that as a foundational backdrop to the world. Then, because the other thing that you do associate with pirates is classic adventure fiction, because piracy invented adventure fiction with Treasure Island. So I wanted to be like, well, yeah, this is still a role-playing game. At the end of the day, even if the world is like thoughtful and soulful and melancholic, we need people to have sword fights because that is going to happen at a role-playing table, and we need the universe to support that. So like, I guess part of the process is looking for themes and looking for compelling images, but really you can start anywhere with anything when world building. And okay, I will take back everything that I've said, and I'll say the best place to start is to find out what is your group interested in and try to put as much of what they are interested in as possible and work with them when building it, because you want them to be as invested in your world as you are. And if they're not, it's not going to be as fun, because it will feel like, well, they're not making the right decisions. They're not playing the right way. And it's like, well, but that's because the world that you built wasn't accounting for the decisions that they wanted to make. So like starting from that perspective of where are we finding interest and how do we build interest into what we're doing? I think you can't really go wrong there.
This is kind of a follow-up question to what you were just saying, but I had kind of a similar question about scale, which is when you specifically are world building, how far, I guess, do you build, if that makes sense? Or like, I'm just curious because I feel like, we see, especially from like the professional tabletop industry, you sometimes see these like absolutely massive tomes of like lore. We're just wrapping up on our podcast, A Blades in the Dark campaign, which, that game has a whole third of the book that's just the details of the city and the culture and all that stuff. But of course, that is hard for most players to like keep track of and stay invested in. So how far do you go when you're making original work?
I mean, this is a great question. I think what you want is to give people compelling hooks or compelling platforms for them to build their own ideas on. And the what you will need to do in order to do that is probably going to be different for each group and different for each player. One of the reasons that the world building guide is structured in the way that it is there are different exercises that at the end of the day, they are just providing you a specific kind of foundation. Like, there's in the sci-fi exercises, there's a sci-fi exercise for defining how faster than light travel works in your universe. There is an exercise that's actually a mini game called Time to Face the Strange, where you take different pieces of technology and define how those technologies have altered society. One is kind of like big picture, faster than light travel really only tells you one thing, but from that platform, you can go like, okay, well, if moving faster than light takes weeks and whatnot, like all of our spaceships, you kind of need to be able to live in them, or maybe there's a stasis between ports or what have you. It defines kind of the shape of your universe. Like the group that lives in kind of like a confined but cozy home is different than the group that like hops into tubes and wakes up at their next location. That, like, based on what you're trying to do, that can provide you with compelling details about how all of this works. Meanwhile, like the how does technology change society exercise of Time to Face the Strange, it is giving you cultural world details that revolve around big conflicts and give players opportunities to see themselves as part of those conflicts and part of those movements, and use that as the axis by which they, turn the world with their story. So it's scattershot. I am providing you with details that are very big, details that are very small, details that are very well fleshed out, details that might be, this is just a single location that is very visibly detailed or whatnot. Because I think different people are going to get hooked by different levels of information. And there are some people who would love a 300-page tome that explains world details, like down to every last rock and screw in a tavern or whatever. But there are certainly people like me. It's like, that's too much information. Tell me like one cool thing, and I will make an idea based on that one cool thing. With Skyjacks in particular, because Skyjacks is a role-playing setting that I have developed to, hopefully eventually one day be a role-playing game. And in my story, like the story is in a way kind of like an advertisement to help people like realize why this would be a fun world to play in and whatnot. The world building details that I'm trying to do, it's not just like, a lot of them are, I'm building these details to make the character stories more interesting. But world building details that aren't directly tied to my main cast are there to help people see themselves in the fiction. One of the best examples of this, I think, is Heartroot Tea. If you are not a listener to Campaign Skyjacks, Heartroot Tea is a herbal remedy that exists in the world that helps people physically transition their bodies as part of a gender transition. And it's like a neat thing because like heartroot, like the herb that is the basis for this tea, grows everywhere and it's really easy to grow. So it's so much more accessible than like transition medications in our own world. And also it has like this thing of you can mix heartroot tea with different ingredients to fine tune exactly, how you want yourself to be at the end of this transition process. And all of that is to say to, my trans listeners, hey, you are a part of this world, and your experience as a trans person is a part of this world. It's easier and more fun to be trans in this world than it is to be trans in our world. But like, it's not we're waving a magic wand and you look however you want, because that eliminates the process of transness. This includes transness as a concept in that like it is a moving and evolving thing. Some people, you know, like with their heart root tea would change the recipe at some point. Maybe they don't have a finished destination. Maybe they are constantly, you know, shifting themselves at their whims because like that is what it feels like to some people. And that as a world building element means that a listener who has that as like a fundamental and important part of their life and experience can go, oh, I can make 1,000 characters that are like me in different ways in this world. That is a cool world building element. And it's only a very small one. Like it's literally, hey, this kind of tea exists. That is, you know, so tiny, but it can lead people to create their own big ideas. And again, like that means that there is no good way for me to say, well, you stop exactly after you create the tea, because there are some people who are going to be like, well, what does mixing heartroot tea with cinnamon do? Like, what does cinnamon feel like to me? Is cinnamon growing like body hair in certain areas, like, you know, and that can be a whole fun experience for people, and that could be a fun, compelling detail, and there might be a portion of the audience that wants to hear about things like that. So, you know, there's no wrong way to go with that rabbit hole. But if I were to devote 10 episodes of Skyjacks to really fleshing out exactly all of the specific like functions of heartroot tea and whatnot, I think eventually we'd have diminishing returns on what people were getting out of that experience, even if I was having a lot of fun imagining it. So you, like at the end of the day, like you want people to be able to put themselves in the story, meaning you want to be able to pull people's ideas into your ideas so that they can build off of them and build with them.
Yeah, and I feel like the sign of a really good GM is to be able to pick up on things that the people you're playing with are particularly interested in, or things that they latch onto, and be able to not have an endpoint in mind for those things and actually let that be.
And you know, we don't even need to ascribe that as a inborn talent that you have as a GM. You can just ask people.
Yeah, that's
like,
true.
That's one of the things in the gameplay guide. Like I talked about session zeros, and hey, ask people what they want out of the game, what is interesting and compelling to them about playing in this world, what they want to see for their character. And you can do that again at multiple times while you are playing. You don't have to be somebody who picks up on what people are interested in and intuits it. Like at the start of every arc of Skyjacks, we have a mini session 0 where I go, hey, what is a cool thing that is in this place that we are visiting? Because if I take those ideas, I know for a guarantee that those are ideas that my cast and players think is cool. So they are going to invest in them when they see them presented in front of them. They came up with the idea for Boganalia and Bogwine, but when I showed them the festival and showed them people like exchanging and drinking that wine, they were thrilled because I was just showing them their own idea. So like, to be a really good GM, all you really need to do is put yourself in the position of asking, or be some sort of superhero who figures out exactly what people want.
Probably the first one.
The second one's easier, but it doesn't work for everybody. Certainly not me.
Yeah. Do you have any sort of tips or advice for folks who are new to tabletop role-playing games, or at least new to playing tabletop role-playing games, who may feel intimidated by the sheer volume of games and content available to them, or by the prospect of like acting and role-playing and improvising?
Yeah, those are two different things. So let's divide them up. The first one, I think, yeah, there are a lot of games out there. I would advise you similarly with starting with world building is find interest. You know, you want to do something that you care about. If you don't care about, you know, swords and sorcery, fantasy adventure, don't play D&D. If you care about superheroes, play a superhero game. If you care about Westerns, play a Western game. If you care about noir, play a detective game. Like, there are enough games to support any genre or any interest that you have, and there's no reason that you should invest yourself outside of that, at least to start, because enthusiasm is a huge engine for these games. Enthusiasm will make the whole process so much more fun.
So like if there is a prospect of role-playing or role-playing games that you find intimidating, there are probably games or tools that are designed to minimize the thing that you find most intimidating. If you look at a 300-page rule book like Dungeons & Dragons and go, that seems like a lot of work to learn all of that, I don't know how much of that effort I want to invest. You can always, jump over to a game that is 100-page rule book, or even games that are 2 pages long, and start there. You can pull the complicated mechanics out of the process. It's not a necessary part of it. Role-playing means so much to so many different people. There's no one way to do it. So if there is something that you find especially intimidating or especially frustrating, I guarantee you there is a game out there that doesn't really deal with that. Same thing with like first-time game masters. If there is something that you feel really secure in about being a game master, like your world building or like your character role playing, you can lean on that. And if you are like, I'm not really good at designing scenarios or encounters, there are people who just write those up, and you can buy their content, and that will make them happy. And then you won't have to worry about that. And you don't need to follow the whole campaign. You can take somebody's fun goblin encounter and you can put it in your own story. You choose what you want, and there is supplemental material for pretty much any aspect of this, including like volumes written by people who just like created robust NPCs or, extremely complex and well fleshed out universes and settings that you can hop into. All of like pretty much every aspect of this game has some kind of tool to make the idea of role-playing easier. On the other side, if you are intimidated by improvising and talking in character and whatnot, I would advise you to start by playing a micro RPG of some kind, a smaller RPG, especially a comedy game. Something like a Honey Heist, I think is good, because that will show you how unimportant it is for you to need to be creative to have fun. Like when you start playing bears trying to steal some honey, like the ideas might be very small. You might just go, yeah, my bear mauls somebody. You will discover how fun that is and how you don't need to put a bunch of artistic creative pressure on yourself. I think that is a good place to start. The other bit of advice, which might sound a bit weird, do a wacky character voice. Ideally something that doesn't embarrass you to do, but definitely something that you can go big with. Because if you go big with like a choice like a character voice or something like that, that will help you put more energy into your performance. And this gets a little bit theater kid, hippy dippy. Like we talk about energy a lot in terms of performing like backstage and whatnot. But like the more energetic you are with your performance, the more the people around you will feed off of that, and the more fun everyone at the table will have. I can almost guarantee it. Absolutely just find ways to invest yourself in the game. And at the end of the day, if you try that and you don't like it, but you still want to play role-playing games, you don't need to do any of that either. There are plenty of people, I've seen people third-person narrate role-playing games where they go, Lanayalin opens the door and walks in and pulls their sword, or Lanayalin explains to the guard that he is lost and, needs help getting out of the place as a bluff. Like, that is a fine approach to role-playing. You don't need to talk as a character. You don't need to do much improvising. You can create a separation between yourself and your character. But it's still playing the game. And if you're having fun, that's the right way to do it.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on, I'll just say thank you so much, James, for talking with us. I really enjoyed this conversation and really enjoyed the book. So thanks for that.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad that you read it and got some joy out of it. I love seeing these things go out there in the world and what people create with them. So I'm so glad that I got a chance to talk about it here, and I hope folks listening were inspired to pick up their own and use it to collaborate with to build out your own wonderful ideas.
Dungeons & Drama Nerds is produced by Todd, Backus, Percival, Hornak, and Nicholas Orvis, and is mixed and edited by Anthony Sertel Dean. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at DN Drama Nerds. Check out cast files on our website, dungeonsanddramanerds.com, and tune in next week for another episode of Dungeons & Drama Nerds.